Hi again, everyone. Patrick Fingston here. I write the Illinois political newsletter, which you can read every day at theillinoise.com. We write about state government and politics every single day. And when we last talked to you a couple of weeks ago, we were nearing the end of the legislative session, where we were concerned. There was concern that the Democrats would be able to land the plane, as they say. And turns out those fears were warranted. They blew past their apportioned deadline, had some drama, and there's even some post session drama between some of our state's top Democrats. And we'll get into all of that in our show today. We already had a scheduled interview with State Comptroller Susana Mendoza to talk about the state budget that was passed and signed into law this week. She's, of course, one of the state's financial experts, as the comptroller who signs all the checks that the state sends out. But she's gotten herself into a little tiff with the governor and his staff over the budget and the idea of cuts. And that's kind of become its own thing. We'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. We'll also be joined by Brenden Moore of Lee Enterprises. That's the Bloomington Panagraph, Decatur Herald and Review, etc. He covers the State House very well. We'll talk about the end of the legislative session, the high drama in the State House at the end of May, and get his reaction to what we saw there as well. First, let's kind of back up a little bit. The legislature had set a May 24th uh, self-imposed budget deadline, and we knew that in the waning days of that week before like Memorial Day, that they were going to have a hard time getting this done. There seemed to be some infighting. There seemed to be some issues among Democrats, and they couldn't get it done. The Senate comes back, passes a budget the day before Memorial Day. The House comes back after Memorial Day, and in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, they pass the budget. 3:30 in the morning, they're trying to pass a tax increase bill on things like gaming and business, etc. And it turned into a real mess. It took three votes. There was a huge confusion. Some legislators that had left in the middle of the night that were needed for their vote, and it was a real mess. We did kind of a TikTok story that I'll put in the description on this on the video side here for those of you that would want to click on that and read it. It turned into a real mess, and eventually Democrats found someone that would flip his vote at 4:30 in the morning, and Republicans were pretty outraged. This was State Representative Patrick Windhorst, who's been on this podcast before, around 4:30 in the morning, as they were about to take a third vote, getting pretty upset about the whole situation.
I think it's clear to everybody what's going on here. It takes the super majority. How many times to get this right in your mind? You pass these rules. These are your rules. I think you're wrong with the motion to reconsider. That's not the appropriate process. Rule 72 is clear about what's to occur with concurrences. It says you get 2 votes on a concurrence. Both of those failed. I think it should be clear to everyone in this state what this supermajority is willing to do to ram a tax increase down the throats of the citizens of Illinois. At 4:30 in the morning, 3 votes. 3 votes.
So, of course, that tax increase did eventually pass. If you're a Democrat, no harm, no foul, right? But not so easy. State Comptroller Mendoza, who we mentioned, we'll be speaking to in just a couple of minutes. She did a TV interview earlier this week on WGEM in Quincy, where she mostly had nice things to say about the budget, but there was one line that stood out to some specific people in the governor's office.
This budget, I would say, is like vanilla. It's not super exciting by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also not risky. There's a lot of good things in the budget. I would have liked to have seen perhaps some more cuts across the board.
So that starts a firestorm with the governor's office, the idea of cuts across the board, which is not an idea that many Democrats, especially the progressives that inherit the or that have the second floor in the state house right now, currently support. Uh, the the reaction, Mendoza got attacked on Twitter by some of Pritzker's top staff. Emily Miller, who essentially heads the legislative office, said more cuts across the board was the other guy. We won. And the governor, after he signed the budget on Wednesday, even took a shot at Mendoza.
Well, I want to remind all of you that the across the board budget cuts, this idea is not an idea that Democrats believe in. This idea that you can just go across the board and cut 5% of the budget and not have a very deleterious effect on people all across the state. I'm willing to talk with anybody about good ideas for how to tighten up our budget to make sure that we're being efficient and spending money well and making cuts. Happy to talk about all that. But you've got to have specific ideas, because this idea that you're going to cut across the board, what do you want to cut? You want to cut education by 5%? You want to cut health care across the board? What is it exactly that you want to cut? So it's easy to make these proclamations, usually Republicans make, about across-the-board cuts.
So that's the governor, the Democratic governor, basically accusing a Democratic statewide elected official of sounding like a Republican. It doesn't seem like all is well among the leaders in this state. Let's get more now as we bring in Susana Mendoza. Comptroller, welcome. I think we need to address kind of the elephant in the room that you're kind of having a little beef with some of the governor's folks and maybe the governor himself after you gave a TV interview that mentioned the term across the board cuts. The governor's senior advisor, kind of his legislative director, Emily Miller, said more cuts across the board was the other guy. We won. The governor, when he signed the budget into law on Wednesday, said cuts across the board are a Republican idea. You are most certainly not a Republican. What's your reaction to this, and how do you feel about how this situation has progressed?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding here. I will own the fact that I said in an interview about my budget react, I did use the word across the board, the words across the board when I was talking about wanting to see some sort of cuts. And I should have been more clear and said targeted cuts within state government. And if you would have listened to, or anybody would have listened to the entirety of my interview, they would have seen exactly what I was talking about. And I made reference to immediately after saying across the board cuts, that what I was referring to was cuts from within. So, for example, when I first took office as controller during, what by all objective measure would have been the worst possible time, the most difficult time to run the state's finances and have to manage them in the role as controller, back in 2016, in my first budget for 2017, I instituted a self-imposed 10% cut to my office's budget. Nobody asked me to do it. Nobody mandated I do it. I'm an independently elected office, and I chose to lead on the issue of self-imposing a cut. So I cut 10% of my budget, and I didn't just do it during that worst year of the fiscal impasse, but I did it for 6 full budgets. And I think that is tremendous. And having said that, we were able to save taxpayers $14 million over that period of time by doing more with less and frankly, providing the best type of service to Illinois taxpayers while turning around the state's finances from horrific to what we now have 9 credit upgrades. And so I'm just saying that I think we should always be looking internally in every budget, whether it's a great budget year, whether it's a tough budget year. No matter the budget year, we should always be looking to see if there's additional cuts that can be made without compromising service and government operations, right? This should not be controversial in the slightest. Now, I did say across the board, I really meant to say targeted cuts from within state government, but the point is the same. When we are crafting budgets, any chance that we get, whether it's a state agency or all the state agencies, all the constitutional offices, it shouldn't just be the controller's office that did this for 6 years in a row. We should all be looking internally and saying, is there a little bit more that we can do? Because remember, it's not our money. It's the taxpayers' money. And every time we can do a little bit of trimming internally, for every dollar that we cut is a dollar less that we have to ask taxpayers to pay in additional taxes. So again, should not be controversial. This seems to be like a mountain made out of a molehill. I don't have a beef with anybody. I honestly had pretty much nothing but complimentary things to say about the budget, but it would have been nice to see some cuts internally. And I know that the governor, look, in May, the governor said he sent out a letter with his deputies. I believe one of the deputies sent out a letter saying that they were looking for the state agencies to cut $800 million worth of cuts because they were looking at revenue increases. So this is not a novel concept. I think making cuts where you can afford to make them is a good thing, and we should always be looking to see if we can do a little bit more. The answer
Yes.
might be no. There might be a state agency that says no, absolutely not. Like for example, DCFS, they're having so much, trouble trying to attract good talent, and they are understaffed. So that's not an agency that is likely going to be able to cut. But there might be others that can. And asking that question as the state's chief financial officer should just be common sense. And if it's not me, whoever the next controllers should be asking those same questions without criticism, frankly.
Yes, Republicans are talking about cuts, that they do. That's part of their brand. But moderate Democrats in the legislature are talking about cuts too. I mean, we've talked about Fred Crespo, who's kind of been poked at by the governor and his people at the same time. But I just had a piece this week with Larry Walsh, who was the deciding vote on the revenue package at 4:30 in the morning last week. That he wanted cuts and reforms, and there were others that were talking to me privately about wanting cuts. What do you account for in the division here inside your own party about those that say, hey, I understand that we can't cut our way out of a potentially bleak picture here where revenue is flat for next year, uh, but 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 still, not necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure. Look, I think we have to continue to make good investments, strong investments in education, in career and technical service programs, in economic development programs, in creating an environment where we're investing in our youth so that our streets aren't as dangerous as they are or they feel right now. There are so many areas that we have to invest, and I think this budget reflects that. But I also think that there's always room, and certainly in the Democratic Party, right? As a controller, you've heard me advocate for fiscal responsibility since the moment I got elected, and I've done that even when I was city clerk, cutting my budgets and providing better service at lower taxpayer cost. And when I was a state legislator, these are things that I take seriously as a Democrat. And I am certainly not going to cede the title of fiscal responsibility or fiscal steward to the Republican Party. I don't know why our party would ever suggest that only Republicans should talk about cutting costs where we can. Again, this is not our money, it's the taxpayers' money. So we have a Democratic Party that has a really big tent, and that's one of the best things about our party. And so I don't think that we should try to silence the voices of other Democrats who also are asking these questions. Can we do a little bit more to rein in costs and show taxpayers that we're trying to earn their trust? So, anybody, whether it's, your leftist to your most conservative member of our party has a voice, and all of those voices should be respected and not tried to be cut down. So, good for Larry Walsh, Representative Walsh, and good for Representative Crespo for making their opinions known. And while I'm not going to say that I take a position on any specific cut that they put forth, at least they're having the conversation, and I think it's important to have. But again, this budget at the end of the day, Pat, to bring it back to this budget, I'm really thrilled that we have a sixth balanced budget that Governor Pritzker has put out and now signed with the help of the legislature. And there are a lot of good things that I talked about before that, of course, were not talked about in this, faux controversy. But at the end of the day, we have a budget, and that's something that we should not take lightly, because I remember the days when we did not have any budget, forget about a balanced budget, but no budget. And we had a backlog of unpaid bills because the controller's office had no legal authority to actually make payments. So anytime we have a budget, and certainly when we have a balanced budget like we've had now for 6 years in a row, you're going to hear me applaud that. I did, in fact, applaud it. And like I said, it kind of went off the rails when I mentioned across the board cuts, really referring to cuts within state government, not to social service providers or to education or to public safety. Those are all things that I always talk about the need to invest more in and to invest more specifically in programs that have a proven return on investment to our tax-paying base. So
You served in the House, so I feel like I have to ask you this. Is it a little embarrassing to watch your party scramble at 4:30 in the morning to pass a tax increase on 3 votes? I mean, it certainly looked bad, right?
I served 11 years in the legislature, and I will tell you that I'm actually very proud of the fact that we've had several years in a row now of budgets where the legislature finishes on time before the May 31st deadline. And I think that's a good thing. And you're always going to have this push and pull and back and forth. But I remember the days where Governor Blagojevich was calling us in every single day of the year throughout the entire year, burning, really wasting millions and millions of dollars with nothing to debate or discuss on the floor. So no, things are always going to get contentious, but at the end of the day, this legislature and the governor got the job done, and we have a signed budget as of today, and that's good news.
All right, so we're 10 minutes in and we've like actually not talked about the budget in the big picture here.
Okay.
So we're talking $53 billion, which is a lot more than the state has spent in compared to what 6 years ago. We're talking about a tax increase that got pushed. We're talking about almost no cuts. I mean, 73 million out of four or out of 52 billion. Don't ask me to do the percentages, but it's not much. Is this budget reflective of where the state is financially in your mind?
Yes, because I do think that while this budget is not perfect, it meets the obligations of the state and does not risk setting us backwards from a financial perspective where the credit rating agencies would look at the work that's been done here and view it negatively. So, these budgets are really critically important to get them done on time. It's something that the credit rating agencies take into account when looking to upgrade or to keep a static or to downgrade. And I believe that with this budget, the credit rating agencies are going to say that it was responsible, that it's, given the fact that while there is an increase, it is below the rate of inflation, and we still have to run this huge government. That it's not an irresponsible budget. It is responsible. Like I said, I always think no matter how great the budget, that we can always do a little bit better, right? But that's always the goal. We should always have that as a mindset. We should still applaud the budget because I think it does meet the obligations of the state while investing in critical areas like education, economic job growth, job training, healthcare, and obviously does more for people with disabilities and in the nursing home space. And I do think those are areas where we're never going to see a return on investment for taxpayers, which is what I always say we need to be investing in. But in this case, uh, if we do nothing else right as a state, we have to take care of our most vulnerable populations. And those would be people in hospice, nursing care, or adults or children with disabilities. And they're never going to make us money, and that's okay. But that's why it's really important to watch how we stretch the value of every other dollar that we do invest in so that we can do a really stellar job of investing in these very vulnerable populations.
There's a lot of frustration, specifically on the right, over the amount of money spent on immigrants, whether they're here legally through asylum, where the federal government is clearly not doing its job, and the governor and the city have been put in a bad spot. But then there's the issue of the health insurance plan for people who are in the country illegally, that folks think we shouldn't be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on, and those are dollars that could be invested not only in Hispanic communities, but in Black communities and in communities across the state. What's your reaction? And clearly, I'm a white boy from downstate. I don't have the greatest grasp of this issue. You have a better one, obviously. So walk me through in your mind how you feel about how we're handling the immigrant issue, and I don't think people realize that the asylum seekers and the health insurance plan are two different pots, two different issues, but they're still there. So how do you react to that?
Yeah, they're still there. And the problem is, again, that this is more of a federal issue that unfortunately states like Illinois have to grapple with. I mean, we are a compassionate state that believes in taking care of people who live in our state. The reality of it is that these are our neighbors. There are our kids, our kids' friends' parents, right? They might be our kid's friend from school. We don't know, but what we do know is that they're a part of our society. The problem here, though, is if you don't want to look at this from the moral perspective of, being a compassionate society that takes care of others without asking them what their immigration status is, we should look at it from a financial perspective. And yes, it is a large output of money, but by law, hospitals cannot reject a person whether they have legal documentation or not from medical services. And so if these folks don't have the ability and we don't invest the money on getting them preventative care, which is so much less expensive than emergency care, then their only other option is to go to the emergency room where federally we are prohibited from, sending them away. So one way or another, Illinois taxpayers are paying for this, whether they like it or not. The question is, do we want to pay more or do we want to pay less? And while this does seem like a large amount of money that's going out in this budget, I think over time we will see that we will be saving a significant amount of money in these unpaid claims that, taxpayers end up picking up one way or another. So, we will see, I think over time, that the more you can get people to go to a preventative care procedure, right? Before you actually have a heart attack because you weren't taking care of your healthcare in a very inexpensive way. Now you have to treat the heart attack, or you have to treat the dialysis patient, or you have to treat, diabetes once it's out of control and the expenses associated to that, or stroke victims, many things which could be prevented through preventative care, which is infinitely less expensive than what we pay for year to year on, emergency care. So again, it's a financial thing, but it also is a moral thing, and I think we need to look at it from both prisms.
Listen, you and I live 5 or 6 miles from each other, so we're kind of in that same ballpark of the world, and we know cost of living is through the roof, right? Go to the grocery store. Anyone who goes there knows sees what inflation has done. The grocery tax will have a little impact, I'm sure. Property taxes, obviously, it's tough to live up here sometimes, and that's the case for a lot of middle and lower income families. Do you believe that this budget, that the state in general is doing enough to handle and address this cost of living crisis we're seeing in the state?
So again, Illinois is one of 50 states who all are posed with their own issues of grappling with inflation. And I do think that when you look at the final numbers, that this is about a 1.6, I think, percent increase over the last one, knowing that inflation is well above that. I think that the legislature and the governor really tried to do the best they could, remembering that you need to have enough votes to pass a budget, right? And so at the end of the day, taxpayers will be much better off because we do have a budget. It is balanced, and it is not a huge spending budget. Even if it, you hear people talk about certain line items and might have seen, large increases. But again, as I said, you have to weigh it against the cost of if we don't act in this way, if we don't invest here, what's it going to cost us on the back end? That is perhaps what people don't see because it's not listed in the budget. But these are actual expenditures that happen that my office as controller has to pay for, right? And so, that's why I try to explain this in a way where folks, even if they disagree with the policy or they don't want, for example, undocumented immigrants to live here, the federal government is not doing anything to fix the situation. So in the absence of that, we can't physically, do things that maybe people would want to be done. And so as a state, we have to deal with the situation, and we need to look to do it in the way that costs the least amount of money possible. This
Last
budget, it needs X amount of votes to pass. Without those, 60 votes, you're not going to have the budget. And it's never, ever going to be a perfect budget. There's no such thing. It has to be a budget that can get enough votes. And you saw that they didn't even have the votes up until the very last minute. So this wasn't a budget that, was an easy budget to pass, but it's the best budget that had a chance of passing at this time. And it gets the job done. No one's going to think it's perfect, but it's certainly a lot better than the alternative. And I do think, and I think of it from this perspective as comptroller, is the credit rating agencies, I believe, will look favorably upon the passage of this budget, and that's important for taxpayers to know.
Before we let you go, the rainy day fund will be at about 2.2 billion, I think, after this budget is enacted and funded. Uh, if revenues drop, if they stay flat, if pressures continue on the budget, I suspect somebody's going to say let's dip into that rainy day fund. When do you allow that to happen, or are you just like barricading yourself in front of that vault? How does that happen, and when do you potentially agree to open that and saying, yeah, it is a rainy day?
So, Pat, I think you're the one who coined that I would be like a Knights Templar with shield and armor, right? Something like that. My sword and shield.
Straight
Uh,
from the
Raiders of the
Indiana
Lost Ark.
Jones movie. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And no, that's exactly how I feel. So I did love that analogy because I think it's accurate. The rainy day fund should only be tapped into in case of an economic collapse through no fault of our own. We are not where we need to be yet. So it definitely is not something that should be tapped into because someone has a pet project or feels that it's raining. It really has to be when there's like a monsoon or a hurricane that rips through Illinois. Examples of that would have been the 2008 budget collapse, or the economic collapse in the country, that every state saw themselves go backwards. Another example would be the terrorist attacks of 9/11. I mean, I hate to say that out loud, but that was a real incident that had a major impact on our
Well, and that
state.
emptied the rainy day fund then. I mean,
Exactly.
there was a rainy day fund
But
then, and
it
then
really was.
Blagojevich got elected, and there was no rainy day fund anymore.
Exactly. And it really was raining. And we didn't have that much in there to begin with. But yes, that would be an example of when it would be appropriate to tap into the rainy day fund. And then, of course, during the budget impasse, right? 736 days without a budget, you absolutely had to empty out the rainy day fund. And, I had $48,000 in the rainy day fund at that time to deal with a almost $17 billion backlog of unpaid bills. So you're going to continue to hear me talk about the importance of rebuilding that rainy day fund. I take a lot of pride in where it's at because I don't think it would be there without the advocacy that I've shown on this issue for 6 full years, 7 years actually now. But having said that, I'm going to continue to protect it and continue to advocate for building it up, which is why I really believe that the legislature and the governor should get behind my proposal to increase payments into the state's rainy day fund and our pension stabilization fund so that in future years where we have better than expected revenues and we're paying our bills on time, that the first money that we spend would actually go towards paying down our pension obligations and saving more for a rainy day. Those are things that I think we should codify into practice now while we're in charge, and not leave it up to future governors or future legislators to decide to continue the financial discipline that we've exhibited over all these years. So that's my position on that. I will continue to make the case that Illinois right now, even with 2.3 billion by the end of June 30th in that rainy day fund, will only have about 15 days worth of reserves, when the average across the nation is 46 days worth of reserves. So while we're doing a lot better than the less than 30 seconds that we had when I took office, we're still not close to where we want to be. And that's why we have to hold the course, stay the course, and continue to invest more into the state's rainy day fund every chance we get.
Comptroller Susana Mendoza, we appreciate the time. We appreciate your honest feedback, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Comptroller Susana Mendoza for joining us, as she had a lot on her plate after this little hubbub kicked out this week between she and the governor, and giving us her thoughts on the budget and the state's financial picture. Let's talk a little bit more about the politics of this with Brenden Moore, the Capitol reporter, State House reporter for Lee Enterprises. All right, we're post session. Everyone's had a little break. Everyone's taken a little breath. The budget's signed. It's law. Probably no court challenges that'll take place at this point, or any serious ones. So let's look back. We're here to talk about that with Brenden Moore of Lee Enterprises. Covers the State House for them. It's Bloomington Pantagraph, Decatur Herald and Review, Post Dispatch, et cetera, et cetera. Brenden, I appreciate you taking some time. I want to start with this kind of out of the blue fight between Susana Mendoza and the governor's staff. We played earlier the clip of the governor where it says Democrats don't believe in cuts across the board, and Mendoza being attacked uh, by Pritzker's people. She's kind of walked back that across the board statement that's not really what she meant. She meant Democrats shouldn't be afraid of cuts. This is usually the time when Democrats all stand up, sing kumbaya, and say, "Look how great we are." And now we're kind of seeing some internal squabbles. What do you make of that?
Well, Patrick, I think that a lot of it's been simmering under the surface for years now, and a lot of it has been papered over a little bit because there has been money to work with over the past few years. It's a lot easier to get along when you have $1 million to throw around to each member, and they could go out into their districts and spend it on projects and ribbon cuttings and whatnot. So but obviously this year we saw a bit of a tighter budget picture than we have in the past few years. They balanced the budget, or at least they claim the budget is balanced, but they had to do it by raising a bunch of new revenue, including some tax increases. And so I think that you're starting to see some of the supermajority Democrats uh, starting to reconcile with the fact that revenue growth is slowing down, but there are still a lot of programs and perhaps some pet projects that are going into the budget, and that maybe not this year, but next year and the years to come there may be some difficult conversations to be had. So and obviously, with the Democrats being a supermajority caucus, I mean, they have 2/3 of the seats in both the House and the Senate. Very diverse caucuses, a lot of opinions. And so, I think that it's only natural that you see some division a little bit among some of the members. And we're just maybe seeing it start to percolate to the surface a little bit more now that we're getting into maybe some tighter budget times.
And it's not just at the top. The inside baseball for those that don't hang out at the Capitol. That last what was supposed to be the last week of session, there was a late night. We were trying to figure out what was going on. You and Dan Petrella and I were all standing along the rail on the third floor, and I sounded like Rain Man, just trying to walk through where this fight is coming from, where this is all falling apart. And I think the perception was that this was going to be the progressives in the House Democrat and Senate Democrat caucuses that were holding things up, saying we want more. But if you go and look at our story this week with Larry Walsh, who was the flip flopping deciding vote on the tax increases, the statements Fred Crespo has made, other comments I've heard from moderate Democrats, that this was maybe more of a moderates holding things up than it was progressives. And that's kind of contrary to everything we expected, and we're trying to piece through at 11 o'clock at night in the state house.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a surprise, especially, when like you think back a few months ago, early in the session, how many press conferences were we at where you had these groups promoting these great causes, progressive causes, child tax credit, which did get in the budget, a much smaller version than was proposed. But like all these things, more money for evidence-based funding, like things that a lot more spending, and a lot of progressives, supporting those causes. But at the same time, I do think, just talking to some of them throughout the session, uh, it was beaten into their skulls pretty early on that this is going to be a tight budget year, that there was not going to be as much money to work with. And so I think many of them were a little bit more realistic with their expectations. But on the other side of it, I think you had a lot of moderates that look at the budget and looked at what was initially proposed by the governor and where they actually ended up, which is about 53.1 billion in spending, and they're like, whoa, we have gone just in what, 6 years, I think it's gone from like 38, 39 billion general fund budget to 53. Like we may need to get that in control a little bit. And obviously this year they had to raise some taxes to balance the budget. You have a lot of, and it's election year. It's an election year. So you have a lot of moderates that were probably not keen on voting for any tax increase in an election year, um, even if it's not going to hit most Illinoisans. I mean, I think most of these are, larger corporations and, people that do sports betting. Um, but yeah, I think that you're starting to see moderates push back a little bit on this really robust growth in spending. And again, should be to be fair, and the governor's pointed this out, that revenue has grown as well, and they've been able to balance the budget every year. But again, I think a lot of folks are realizing that this may not last. And I should say too, I mean, you get like people like Fred Crespo that are talking, and some other moderates, but you talk privately with some progressives, they will even admit to you that there's a bit of a spending problem, that next year might be difficult, that there might be some difficult conversations around budget time. And so I think that as revenues start to slow down a bit, we're really starting to see some of these more difficult conversations, some of these things that have been simmering under the surface that, you know, again, you can kind of figure it out when you have money to work with. But that's starting to come to the surface a little bit more, and I think moderates are definitely starting to flex a little bit of muscle within the caucus, because the progressives have really been at the forefront. I feel like in the past few years, and now the mods are saying, "Hey, we're here too," and we you can't just rely on us to rubber stamp things. And again, they made it difficult to get to land this budget plane.
The governor has been very vocally almost upset when people talk about future potential problems in the budget, and essentially says it hasn't happened yet. Republicans, this, that, the other thing, round or bad, the same playbook that we typically see. But COGFA, has put out its report that spending or that revenue is essentially flat next year. At least that's a projection.
Mhm.
There's not enough revenue growth in the projection next year to even cover the EBF increase, the baseline education funding increase, not to mention pensions, not to mention the transit fiscal cliff that's coming. There are more mouths to feed than there is food to feed them. Are you surprised that the governor has been so combative about future potential problems instead of saying, "Yeah, we've got work to do in the future"?
Not necessarily, because I think he does have a point in that. I mean, these are just projections that we really won't know until we get closer to budget making season next year, what it actually looks like. I mean, obviously, the governor's office every year puts out a 5-year forecast for revenues, and it's been, at least the past few years, it's been pretty inaccurate, projecting much larger deficits than actually, took place. And in fairness to him, I mean, in I think he's a little defensive because a lot of the comments are coming from Republicans, and basically, you kind of get into that partisan mode. But he actually has, when he's been in the position to, he has said that no matter what, his red line is we have to balance the budget. And so, he's been pretty consistent on that, even as he has been defensive on some of the criticism from Republicans and from some moderate Democrats. Um, but obviously, if that's the mantra of we have to balance the budget, then you're going to have to reconcile some things if it does slow down next year, because there
That
will be that.
I
Yeah.
mean, he's not a cutter. He's not a guy that wants to go and cut any spending. I mean,
Right.
it was 73 million in a 52-53 billion dollar budget this year. I mean, it's nearly nothing. So I mean, by that logic, you're saying this guarantees a tax increase next year.
Well, and that's going to be where the conversation probably goes, is like, are there places we can cut? And then where can we find more revenue? And as Representative Crespo said on the floor a couple weeks ago, uh, after a while you run out of places to find new revenue, and it becomes a tougher conversation because yeah, you can raise tax on sports books, and you can, extend the sunset on the corporate the losses corporations can claim on their taxes. You can do some of those things, but after a while, what is the next thing? What is
Yeah,
the where
that
is the next
personal
push?
income tax, that corporate income tax really starts to look at risk.
It possibly so, and obviously, again, we none of us really are going to know the full picture until we get closer to it and what the situation is going to be. But obviously, we've seen in the past when during uncertain budget times because during the pandemic, which ended up not being as terrible because of stimulus money and because the economy recovered a lot faster than people expected. But that FY21 budget, for instance, did not include the EBF 350 million, the only year that it hasn't happened. So I mean, that could be an example of like if you are in tough budget times, if you have to decide, if we can't raise revenue, where do you cut? Do you cut, funding for K through 12? Do you cut funding for, pre-K? Do you cut funding, for social service agencies that, that provide services for Illinois residents? It's a tough thing. It's a tough conversation to have. But obviously, as the budgeteers often like to say, we have, there are infinite needs but finite resources, and you can only do so much with what you have to work with. And and obviously it's not just the governor. I mean, you need 60 votes in the House and 30 in the Senate, and that's no easy task. They all, the governor may be a spender, but I think rank and file Democrats are probably even more so. Except for some of the mods, but obviously everybody has projects in their districts they want to fund and programs, and they have bills they want to fund. And I mean, I can tell you how many times we saw like bills passed this year that were subject to appropriation, and and so you can tell like there's a lot of people that have ideas that are maybe good and beneficial, but the question always is there going to be enough money in there to fund it? And we will see.
I usually wrap these things up by doing a kind of a where we go from here sort of question, but I'm going to go backward if you don't mind, because
Mhm.
you were in the House chamber, I assume, at 4:30 in the morning
I was.
when let's be fair, all hell broke loose in ways that we haven't really seen in the legislature. I mean, I covered my first session in 2006, so I've seen a few of these over the years. You don't see stuff like this happen very often, where you have three votes on a tax increase bill and Democrats scrambling trying to figure out what to do next. Uh, I understand that they're all trying to save face a little bit, but just how wild was it inside that chamber at 3:45, 4:30 in the morning, and at points in that we didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah, it was insane because especially the past few years when with the Democrats, I mean they drew a very good map. So they have these huge super majorities, 78 in the House, 40 I believe in the Senate. So in the House, like most bills pass pretty easily, like with 70 plus votes. It's not even a controversy. But this was tight because you had 5 members that were absent. You had a vacancy because Mark Walker's seat hadn't been filled, and then you had a bunch of members that either didn't wanna vote for a tax increase or, were being protected because they're in tougher districts. And so you had it where, uh, they clearly had a number. It got, uh muddied up because State Representative Aaron Ortiz left Springfield and didn't tell anybody, so they were down a member.
By
Uh,
the way, has anyone seen or heard from him yet? I guess he sent an apology letter, but like his parents must be worried. Like, is he alive? Is he accounted for?
uh, I haven't,
It's
I haven't.
so crazy, so
It's
crazy.
crazy. So they had to do it the second time, and obviously they had a member or two that they could pull off as a no vote. That could be a yes vote at they are absolutely needed. This happened to be Larry Walsh, and Larry, Representative Walsh, was a yes vote until he saw 61 votes up there. Then he went back to no, and because he thought there were 60. Happened to be a Republican who voted yes, and he quickly dipped out of the chamber, and they had requested a verification, so he was removed from the roll. So they had to do it a third time, and they had to suspend the rules to do that. And again, we were trying to figure out in real time what was going on because, I don't think a lot of us have memorized the House rules. Honestly, I think the Republicans, I think, were the only ones that knew the rules that the Democrats wrote, and they had to suspend the rules. And they eventually third time was the charm, but really it was embarrassing for the supermajority Democrats. I mean, they were clearly caught off guard, and they were, I guess, lucky that they had the force. Somebody had the foresight to suspend the rules because if not,
Dan Dittich. Yeah, Dan Dittich is the one that ran to the well.
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that because if they did not, like, that would have been a massive failure for the supermajority party. Would have been really a black eye for Speaker Welch, um, and so they got it done. I mean, and as the speaker said before letting his members go home, they never said the House wasn't boring or wasn't some version of that quote. Um,
Nobody ever said the House was boring. Yeah.
Nobody ever said the House was boring. Yeah, I mean, and it certainly was not that night.
Yeah, it's funny. I was there. I was talking to a Democrat before that night, and he was talking about how the House was being the entertaining one, and I'm like, I'm a Senate guy. You all are crazy to me. So this is, it was outrageous for those of us that do this
Mhm.
for a living. So,
Yes.
Brenden Moore, Lee Enterprises, find his stuff on Twitter and Bloomington Panagraph. Great stuff, great reporter, and always appreciate you taking some time with us, Brenden.
Always a pleasure, Patrick.
Thanks to Brenden Moore from Lee Enterprises for joining us to talk about state government and mess around the end of the legislative session. It was really wild to watch, and I appreciate his comments on that. And thanks to Comptroller Susana Mendoza for joining us as well. And thank you for taking the time to join us, whether you watch us on YouTube or listen to the traditional podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and talk about state government and politics. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next time.